America's leading industry is still the manufacture, distribution, packaging, and marketing of bullshit.
With a government beholden to billionaires and real estate, or our vision for the future. We are done with empty promises wrapped up in flimsy packaging of dishonesty and corruption.
Feed the rich and feed the poor. This is class war.
You don't lose anything by losing faith, okay? What you gain is reality.
Hello, virtual sim lifers and perhaps new listeners from the Substack. Thank you for clicking here for an introduction to a series on the topics of bullshit and biases, or at least the way that we can find that word described in research papers, regardless of how people in your life might have used it. We'll talk about what it is and how you can spot it through conversations and arguments, a few of which are real conversations that I've had with a Silicon Valley rich guy who thinks he's very smart. And if commenters want to give examples of cognitive biases, then I'll use those too, so people can see how conversational tactics are used in everyday speech to lie and manipulate. To do so, we have to trace the links back to what motivates or tricks people into doing these conversational tactics. Because isn't it just kind of wild that most people don't even realize that they are doing it, because bias is really sneaky like that. It can even fool us. So that's exactly why we should take it so seriously. Our biases can make us look really stupid or cause us to make bad decisions. And I'll be doing it while playing my favorite capitalist gremlin simulator, Denizen, where you grind the rags to riches of a rundown apartment in the low-income part of town while doing the shift work to the riches of the American dream through exploiting labor at your retail businesses and the local tenants of your rental market. And if that's not enough for your virtual ego, you can drag race the exotic car that you bought or DJ at the downtown nightclub. This game even has its version of Tinder. It's all the cynicism of life under this economic system in one game, because they didn't leave out the gambling, consumption of alcohol, or the manufacturing of drugs either. But through this series, you could also see how thoughtless the masters of our world actually can be, because they struggle with emotional stability as a byproduct of something that happens to the brain when you don't have to socially cooperate anymore. Money and positions of power make it too easy never to practice the skill that gives you compassion, and the neurons in your brain could atrophy if you don't have to get along with others. Think about what happens in solitary confinement to prisoners or Arctic researchers isolated for long periods of time. A team studied rich people's heads under an MRI, and it's definitely interesting what might be making them so successful. It could just be cruelty. Think about what's happening in the world too, and it would make sense. Ever hear the saying, power corrupts? Well, there's a reason why rich people donate the lowest percentage of their wealth to charity compared to the low-income folks. Well, just because they have money, it isn't evidence of intelligence or goodness or morality. It's evidence of greed. Nothing more. But what is greed really? Well, that's the more interesting part. Swap in fear for that word, and suddenly things might make some more sense there too. Rich people are some anxious motherfuckers. Because having privilege generates fear, and the fear of losing its benefits. Well, and how do you see it? Well, you look for their irrational claims. And that's your evidence that their emotions might not be too stable. See, wealthy people are the undisputed champions of spitting bullshit, even if other people who revel in their positions of privilege do it too. And that's not a coincidence. There's a structural reason for that. It's in classism. But how did I find out all this? Well, this footage that I clipped into the video, I either took it or I'm in it. Because that's the circus that I've been dealing with for over a decade as a poor person with an upper-middle-class education and upbringing. But I'm one of the workers that they treat like a second-class citizen through use of biases. Yet they think that they're my friend because we chat in their superficial style of friendship that doesn't involve more than meaningless small talk and gift exchanges. They keep around token poor people to feel validated, but lack the prefrontal cortex to connect on any more authentic level. Rich people really do look down on you. They just won't tell you that because they know it's socially inappropriate, but they can't actually hide it. Tilt them, and I'll bet you that you can get them to do some irrational Karen-like behavior. Don't know how to do that? Well, stick around for the series, and I'm giving tips on how you can get someone to prove that they're a bit of a hater. But this conversational bullshit is impacting us in massive ways by making our decisions for us and running this world into the ground without recognizing the cost it has to ourselves and others. It's so problematic that it can even impact our health. And because of the 1% of the wealthy who are holding on to the world's wealth, we should really learn about the bullshit that they use to tell us all how it's really great that they live like kings while other people struggle to the point of starvation. The real critical thinking, the stuff that ancient philosophers started drafting up a couple thousand years ago, can help us sort out all this modern day confusion in how we talk to each other. With just a few rules of logic and argumentation, we can see straight through the bullshit too. Whether it's a rich guy, your abusive significant other, your aloof and uncaring parent, or your self-absorbed friend, what do politics and narcissism have in common? As much as I know people can hate going there, talking about politics is the only way to get to the bottom of how our world became polarized. We have a culture of narcissism, where ideas that will distort your neurology have become a social norm. One of the topics that I'm going to cover is a sociology paper on how easy it is to dupe Toyota owners because of their own narcissism. You can see this cultural phenomenon popping up in the weirdest of places. Because what does economics have to do with emotional abuse? Well, let me show you through all this. It might stun you what you've been seeing in front of you. The way that you see the world might never be the same. I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm here to share with you some guidelines and some science that I've learned and that you can apply to your thinking to determine what you think for yourself, while trying to be as accurate as possible while doing it. Critical thinking takes a whole lot more than just thinking. It's also about research, media literacy, and analyzing data. It takes work and it's hard. So don't be surprised when people who claim they have critical thinking actually prove that they can't really do it according to what's defined. So, as much as I know, I might say some things along the way that can feel uncomfortable or even irritating. Please just give me a few minutes on the topic and give it some thought. It would mean a lot to the world if everyone could step back and make sure that they're sure. It's okay to question, it's okay to discuss and debate too. But that's exactly why I'm making this series, to talk about the rules that we can follow to make sure that a discussion or a debate stays fair for everyone. So, you ever see a divorced couple fighting that can never seem to quite solve anything? With the subject matter that I'm covering, you can know exactly what's going wrong and how to spot the problem by applying the rules that will mark the errors in a person's reasoning and judgment, as well as a lot of bad ideas that you can red flag in your dates or friends. Because biases aren't just a neutral idea, it's a wrong idea, and wrong ideas lead to bad decisions with unintended consequences. Maybe your bias is just a lie, or emotional abuse, and what if you don't know that it is? Besides, the ability to stay consistent in your principles and beliefs is essential to your mental health, and being fair to others is being fair to yourself. And you will find out how through learning about cognitive biases that humans can generate. Your own irrational ideas can result in biases that cause you to make decisions or bad arguments that won't benefit you in your miscalculation. Reality doesn't really change just because we believe in an idea that we were convinced was true. More than anyone, you benefit yourself through learning about what critical thinking really is, even if everyone professes to have it. But it might disturb you to find out that when this was attempted to be tracked by the California Commission on Teaching Credentialing, while 89% of college professors said that critical thinking was the core focus of instruction, only 19% could accurately define what critical thinking was. Only 9% were teaching it in a way that the board considered meaningful, but overestimated their ability because 81% were convinced that students walked away with critical thinking. As someone who tries to keep practicing their critical thinking at all time, I would think that it would be impossible to nail down the exact numbers, but those are some numbers that do exist from when we tried looking into it. So consider that sometimes maybe people are just bullshitting you when they say that they have critical thinking, because they might be bullshitting themselves too. They assume that they knew what it was, but maybe they don't. But you can test it because there really isn't very many good ways to make an emotional argument into a rational one. So to see how this works, we need some rules that we're going to borrow from thinkers who existed before us. The rules of logic and argumentation, which can be applied to everyday conversations, would reveal potentially interesting things about the psychology of your ideas or the ideas of potential debate opponents, beyond just the bullshit content of their argument points. Because rhetorical devices are a tell. Similar to playing poker, debating is a lot like a con game, but can you spot the one who's doing the con? Maybe tilting is your best move here if your opponent uses logical fallacies, cognitive biases, or other distractions to avoid the topic. This is where we can pick up some lessons from cognitive psychology when we cross it with the debate sphere. Logical fallacies line up with the same cognitive defense mechanisms that you can read about in textbooks that are often experienced by those suffering from anxiety, depression, and personality disorders. With every irrational debate point made, you see that their constructed reality around the idea they're deploying is faulty and confusing. Perhaps they will even refute their own points within minutes. But why does this happen? And why don't facts do much to change minds? Emotional issues is the simple answer. I probably should talk about the neuroscience of what conversation conflict situations do to our brains with neurotransmitters in one of these videos, but the problems with facts is that they can represent more than some harmless piece of information. Facts can allude to a much bigger emotional threat of having one's morals questioned and their very identity evaluated. The threat of being rejected or canceled might be a fate that's worse than death to a person, and the default instinct, almost like animal response, is to attack someone's identity to protect their beliefs. The beliefs that might shield them from talking about ethics or what makes them feel embarrassed. While we might feel this impulse to react to some extent when we're told that we are wrong, it's much more intense in some people, especially those who do not feel confident in their ideas or have even had a history of being made to feel unworthy. If we understand these defensive responses and how we feel when we have them, we can extend that patience to others who struggle with new information. Ever notice that pattern happening in comment sections, or have you randomly found yourself facing personal attacks for saying something about a bad situation happening in society? Well, although you may be new to learning this, you should expect that to happen from now on, and not because you've done anything bad or deserve it. It's that you're fielding the reactions of others who struggle to cope with the bad things they've done or think about themselves. And if you expect it to happen, you might be less surprised when it does, and more prepared to handle it productively. Neurotransmitters are a hell of a force. Sudden personal attacks during political discussions are a response worth noticing. It's a sign of reactionism. And that's one of the topics that I'm going to cover in this series. What a reactionary is, what their underlying ideology is, and how to spot one in a conversation. Also some methods that you can use to shield yourself from their bullshit rhetorical devices with some critical thinking and social science. To understand why facts don't change minds, we first need to understand this nebulous concept of identity. Have you ever put that much thought into it before? Because thinking about identity can actually be a dangerous endeavor. And it's the one that's causing a lot of disruptions. We list identity as a noun in the dictionary when it should be more like a verb. Identity isn't a static object existing somewhere in space. It's a process of our consciousness that's like ever evolving and ever changing. It literally runs on electrical current. So that's a process that involves looking at our traits and our choices and how those played into the actions over our history, or how those features of our identity can affect our future. The world of identity is something that we create within our perception, but we've tried to forge it into something that's almost like real. Like we could make it into a product, an object, where an identity becomes a brand or like a reputation, loosely linked together with constructs about our traits and associations with groups and cultures. How we see our identity in turn shapes how we see others through our ideas about what identities and associations mean. What we like about ourselves, we will like in others, and what we dislike about ourselves, well, you have to wonder what that's going to do. You ever hear someone say people don't change or I can't change? Either is interesting because it's technically incorrect due to what science is majored about identity changing over time in the population. Everyone's personality changes, and even along certain timelines. So why does this idea end up being consequential? Well, first, it's an irrational idea that's not cohesive with what is technically happening with human personalities. But beyond that, the person is locking themselves into believing that they will stay fixed despite any changes that do occur. Perhaps they simply won't even have the self-awareness to notice even if others around them have. Beliefs like this stand in the way of any positive change that could occur, and they demonstrate nihilism. It can be a defense to accountability, which would suggest perhaps things are not going well for them, and they don't think that it's going to get any better, which may indeed be a self-fulfilling prophecy. People don't change is a cognitive bias, an irrational idea that's used to justify a behavior or stance that otherwise doesn't have an excuse. But it's also an outright admission that a person believes that their identity is real and static. The ones that are all most likely to use identity in an attempt to win every argument, as if identity should distract from a valid point being made in a debate. And this is exactly what I mean about a red flag. The real problem underneath isn't the person who's saying that idea, it's the idea itself that was passed on to them by another person and the system in which we often learn how to navigate life. Social learning theory states that we can use processes like imitation to learn, replicating what we see others in our environment do as a form of learning. The form that we had before schools ever existed. And there's nothing wrong with it on its own, but you might see how it could transfer ideas that are scientifically debunked as a form of learning by way of passing it on in communities and echo chambers. And it's largely responsible for how shared biases are formed. But we can further narrow down biases into two categories: the shared biases that can be widely recognized, like stereotypes, or cognitive biases that individuals generate from their own conclusions about their life experience. Patterns of cognitive bias are objective ways to see that people are struggling with anxiety. It's all about the irrational points they make, because it's rather impossible to make a good rational debate point to explain an emotional, irrational behavior or idea. The problem is that most people don't recognize their own emotional behaviors, irrationality of their ideas, or their anxiety. They're blind to it because of their biases about what anxiety or emotional behaviors look like. This is implicit bias, versus its alternate form of explicit bias, when a person will outright admit to their preferences or favoritism. So this is one big circle jerk of emotional problems when it comes to identity, and that's why facts don't change minds. Because a person would have to acknowledge that they're being emotional to see that they have a bias in the first place. Since our biases aren't correct, well, where did they come from? Well, there can only be one place: our emotional attachments. I started down the path of studying behavioral economics, decision-making, and bias over a decade ago. The reason why I ever started is because I recognized how embarrassing it could be when I was so sure of something that I was actually entirely wrong about. It's an ever-evolving process, and you always have to wonder if you should be sure. But that's where the roles of critical thinking can come in to help. This isn't about finger-wagging or virtue signaling, even if I'm talking about bias and morals. What it actually comes down to is our own mental health, how we think about and treat ourselves first, because that's the source for any time that our biases are going to impact somebody else negatively too. We have these wild neurons up in our heads that don't know the difference between you and another person. When you're watching a star football player on TV, your brain gets tricked into thinking that you're them, and it's why you might cringe when you see them get sacked, like it was you who got thrown to the ground. They're called mirror neurons, and they could be the explanation behind this thing called empathy. The better you are to yourself, the more that's going to reflect on the world. But what about those ideas? Are we being good to ourselves with the things that we believe? Sometimes it's our attachment to an idea that holds us back, not the physical world or anyone in it that we could blame for teaching us that idea. This video series is about bias and debating it, and whether that's having a debate with yourself or someone else. It's how we build critical thinking through repetition and constantly looking for answers. No one has to wait to tackle one implicit bias at a time. There's a way to train it out by using the rules of logic and argumentation applied to any argument that we can give ourselves to consider. To be successful in debating others about a topic, you must be good at debating yourself first. And Some neuroscience explains why that effect happens when we spend time strengthening the connections in our brain that have to do with emotional regulation. I know it's the hardest thing that we'll ever have to do, but that's also exactly why it's worth it. The will to power and the will to truth was said by Nietzsche to have come for a need for certainty and control. So perhaps if certainty and control are these so-called cures that the anxious seek, then the will to truth and power might be a better path than blaming the identities of those who challenge their irrational ideas. It ultimately comes down to how much a person wants answers, and you can tell when they didn't, because the biases gave it away. In future videos, I'll be covering in-depth arguments and other ideas I've experienced that demonstrate how identity is used in a way to derail topics that involve corruption, exploitation, and other unethical behavior. Mostly arguing with a rich guy about his unethical behavior, but I'll get more into the science on biases, on how they could control our behavior through the subconscious, even some of our biggest life decisions, including the cars we buy. Through these examples, people can see cognitive biases and logical fallacy errors that people make every day, so that you can call them on their bullshit rhetorical devices, even if they don't know their argument amounts to the definition of bullshit. But the real trick is catching your own bullshit before someone else does. Our own arrogance doesn't help us, but how much do you desire to know what's really happening in the world today? Sometimes it's our attachment to ideas that's generating our own nightmare, and there's no such thing as a free choice when we're attached to a belief system that can't be measured against the real material world of consequences.